Hi, my name's Eliot Cohen. I'm the Dean of Johns Hopkins SAIS, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you all to this conversation with Ambassador Shivshankar Menon. I want to begin by thanking my friend and colleague, Professor Devesh Kapoor, who I think helped arrange this opportunity for a conversation. This is one in a series of discussions that we have as part of the Dean's Forum here. Just a few words of introduction for Ambassador Menon. He is really one of those extraordinarily distinguished diplomat scholars that one occasionally, actually rather rarely, runs across. He served as Ambassador and High Commissioner for India in Sri Lanka, Pakistan, China, and Israel. He served as National Security Advisor under Prime Minister Manmohan Singh. He served as the Foreign Secretary of India, and he's now a professor at Ashoka University, where, among other things, he's been writing some really quite extraordinarily compelling articles, which I will be referencing as we go along. The two in particular that I wanted to call your attention to, I don't know if we can see these on Zoom. One is called India's Foreign Affairs Strategy, that's put out by the Brookings India Center, and the other in the most recent issue of Foreign Affairs called League of Nationalists. With that, let me welcome Ambassador Menon. I think I'll ask our tech support to start video and unmute. There you are.
Thank you, Dean Cohen. Thank you for those very generous words of introduction.
Well, they're well meant. You and I have known each other for a while, and it's a real honor to have you here virtually. I wish we could do it in person. We'll do that sometime as well. So I thought, if I might, I'd like to start the conversation off fairly broadly. I should say that, as is usually the case, we'll be opening up for Q&A half the way through. And what I would ask everybody to do is to use the Q&A function on Zoom. I will, as always, be privileging SAIS students. So I would ask people to put their name and whatever their affiliation is. And like I said, about halfway through, I'll turn to that. And I would urge you to try to get to the head of the queue by putting the questions in early. I thought we'd talk about a number of things, but first, one of the things I've always found particularly interesting about you is you are a big thinker and a historically minded thinker about international affairs. At the beginning of your article on India's foreign affairs strategy, one of the points you make is that, in a way, there were myths basically arising out of the British Raj, which have caused people to misunderstand the importance of India's engagement in international affairs. And I wonder if you could just dilate on that point a bit and talk to us about it, because it seems to me it really informs the way you think about India's foreign relations.
Well, the way I see it, there are some things which, some sort of permanent or semi-permanent features which actually affect a country's foreign policy. And in the Indian case, you know, the subcontinent is a geographical unit. It's had a history of its own. And if you look at that history, it's always been most prosperous, has done best when it's most connected to the world. And yet the version of history that, well, partly the British left us, but many of us have adopted, is one of an India which is unique, which is insular, which has faced repeated foreign invasions and empires, basically land-based empires in the Indo-Gangetic Valley. Now, I can see why the British would tell that story, because it justified what they did, which was foreign invasion, set up an empire in the Indo-Gangetic Valley. They actually only directly ruled about 1/3 of India, of the area of the Indian subcontinent. So I can see why they would tell it, but I don't see why Indians accept this idea. And it's always been an open, syncretic, and geographically too, if you look at it, it's a peninsula. And the links have been maritime with Southeast Asia, with West Asia, all the way back to 2500 BC. And that's where, if you look at the most prosperous, the most advanced parts of India through history, have been maritime India, from Gujarat through Malabar, through the Coromandel coast, into Bengal. And these are the bits that were most connected to the world. So for me, actually, but because we've forgotten this history, and because during the British Raj, it was the Royal Navy that took care of maritime security, the Indian Ocean. So the government in Delhi for about 200 years was sea blind. And we seem to have inherited those attitudes and regard ourselves primarily as somehow landlocked by the Himalayas and now by the creation of Pakistan. So I really think we need to change the way we think about ourselves, about where we are, how we do well, and how we're connected to the world. And I think we shouldn't ignore how connected to the world we've been when we have done relatively well.
So yeah,
Uh,
I was
I
really
don't know if that's too much for one
no. I mean,
first.
as we were saying earlier, we have enough stuff to go on for about 5 or 6 hours, but we won't. Let me just ask a follow-on question. That phrase "sea blind" really struck me when I read it. How unusual are you these days in having that view? Is there a and I'm thinking from the point of view of Indian policymakers primarily. India's obviously a huge place, so there are a lot of different groups of people. Some of whom are, the piece that's plugged into Silicon Valley is highly internationalist, but at the level of policymakers in a country where government officials still carry a lot of sway, how uncommon or how common is the view that you just expressed, which is a different view, as you just said, from a lot of the post-independence thinking about India's place in the world?
I can only say that I think there's more and more people who think that way. And not because of, I mean, I wish I could claim the credit for this or that there was a body of us who were spreading these thoughts. But I think because of the success of the globalization decades, of what happened after India opened up the economy in 1991, liberalized, between 1991, when external merchandise trade was about 15.3% of GDP, and 2014, when external merchandise trade became about 49.6% of GDP. It's not counting remittances, not counting, so the external sector really was more than half GDP. And those are the years when India did best, grew fastest, pulled 140 million people out of poverty. That's not small, and things that we'd never done before. So I think, generally speaking, I think there is much more support for the view today than there might have been, say, 40 years ago, 30 years ago. But it's still not the prevalent view. And there are people in government who understand this, especially the Navy, naturally. I mean, they have an interest in this. But more than that, I think but it's still something that we have to work out for ourselves. It's not today conventional wisdom, far from it. In fact, if anything, in the last few years, we've gone the other way. If you look at it, we've raised customs duties for the last 4 years running. We've walked out of the RCEP negotiations on this big free trade area in Asia, which will be actually the world's biggest if it had included India. And increasingly the call after COVID and after what's happened with China recently is for self-reliance. Now, how far that moves towards autarky, I don't know. In fact, most people who are responsible say it's not autarky at all, but we need to be careful, etc. But in a sense, it echoes what's happening around the world. When you look at China calling for self-reliance, dual circulation, in the US as well, I think there's more and more people saying stop, build resilience, change supply chains. So, yes, I think more and more people saw the advantages of being connected to the world, but I think that now today it's hard to say which way the tide is running. If anything, the official tide is probably running the other way.
And
I assume that self-reliance is a sort of is a useful word for all sides because it's ambiguous enough. I mean, how can you argue against motherhood and self-reliance?
you know,
But
and how much of that is drawing specifically on the the legacy of Gandhi and Nehru and so on, and how much of that is really similar to similar kinds of movements, including in the United States? I mean, would you say, in other words, to what extent is that debate really linked to the foundation of modern India?
you know, both Gandhi and Nehru were internationalists in very different ways. Nehru saw that the opportunity to transform India, to industrialize, develop a modern, secular India, uh, really existed, but could not be done alone. It couldn't be done just with India's resources. And this is why he chose to work with both camps. And, you know, for Gandhiji, it was a more complicated relationship. He he saw that we needed world peace, etc. But he had grave doubts about industrialization, which he saw as destroying the fabric of Indian society. Uh, so while he was internationalist, and if you look at the way he dealt with the international media, he was way ahead of his time, actually, in many ways, and quite a canny politician. And he saw the advantage of working with the rest of the world. But I'm not sure that he was. So I don't think that's what's driving it today. Today, I think what's driving the pushback is really the sense that identity is threatened by globalization, the sense that we need somehow to protect our Indianness. And I think it's that fear combined with those who actually have swallowed the British version of our history entirely, because they now talk of 1,000 years of slavery, which means that the Mughals, all these other people who assimilated and really were Indian and created Indian culture as it is today, they now try and exclude from their definition of India. Now that's a much narrower, insular, and frankly, it's also geographically a definition of an India which basically is the Hindi-speaking heartland, about 33% of the population. That's it. If you go down the logic of that argument. So, but for me, I think the reason it gets a hearing even is because of this fear of loss of identity in a globalized world, and this fear that somehow Westernization is going to destroy Indianness. And you know, there's an appeal to tradition. This becomes more and more attractive, I think, when things get hard
Yeah.
after 2008, of course, but now especially when you have the double whammy of the pandemic and an economic crash.
No, it is extraordinary the way history, including quite deep history, shapes the way that we view the world today. It's a
And the way it
very
rhymes.
yeah. Let me ask so one other large question. You use the phrase in one of your articles that you say we live in an age of strategic confusion. Could you just explain what you mean by that, and then we'll move on and talk about China?
I think my sense is that, you know, the balance of power has shifted in the world in the last 2 decades or so. And that's partly it's a result of globalization, the rise of China, but also the rise of other countries. And if you look at the world today, economically, it is multipolar. You look at shares of global GDP, and the center of gravity clearly has moved to somewhere in Asia. The sources of growth in the global economy are in the Asia Pacific. So economically, this is a much more multipolar world. It's not that the US share has shrunk, no, but the European share has certainly shrunk, and the beneficiaries have been in Asia, have been India, China, Korea, others. Uh, militarily, of course, the, the distribution of power does not match the distribution of economic power. In fact, the only global superpower with the capacity to project military power around the world is still the US. China's a regional military power, but she's catching up. She's trying to make her presence felt. Uh, so it's still primarily a unipolar military world with, but tending towards some form of regional powers who are making it not truly multipolar, but certainly changing the balance. And we are between international orders because the traditional US-led order is no longer providing the public goods that we've all got used to. Uh, so my favorite example is Afghanistan, where frankly, all of us in the region have outsourced our work to the US and can therefore posture and do what we like while the US actually maintains stability and peace there. Uh, Maybe we'll all be more responsible once the US withdraws. I don't know. But therefore, politically, it's a confused world. And that's why when I say there's strategic confusion, because we're between orders and nobody knows what the new order is going to be. I, I don't believe that we're heading towards a China-centered world or, I mean, Martin Jacques wrote, When China Rules the World. I don't think that's going to happen. But I don't think there's any going back to the older so-called liberal international order. I don't think there's any going back to that. And nobody has a clear sense of where we'd like to be even. That's where the confusion actually comes from. If you look at the kinds of authoritarian leaders that we have selected in the last decade or so, most of the major countries, none of them has a vision of the international society that we want or that would serve our interests. So we're not going back to 19th century Europe. We're not going back to what we had before 2008, and that's where the confusion arises, I think, in the lack of big ideas.
Yeah. That makes perfect sense to me. Okay, let's. Well, I mean, it's.
I wish it weren't true.
I wish it weren't true as well. I mean, in the fundamental way, but as one professor to another, it makes our world very interesting, doesn't it?
Yes,
and helping students figure out how to make sense of it and how to interpret it. And I think I agree with you. The challenge is to come up with new frameworks, and that's not easy for anybody. And I don't think you see political leaders who have it. And I'm not familiar with that many academics who have a particularly complex and nuanced view of what that means. I mean, I think the 18th century and 19th century metaphors are impoverished in their own ways. And so we do have to think anew, as Lincoln said. Can we move to China? You were the Indian ambassador and high commissioner to China. You are fluent in Chinese. Can we start with Xi Jinping? I think it's now becoming sort of conventional wisdom, I suppose, that this is really a very different kind of Chinese leader. This is the most powerful Chinese leader, certainly since Deng Xiaoping, maybe since Mao. That his authoritarian tendencies are pronounced, as is his rather belligerent nationalism and indeed willingness to use force. Do you agree with that view, which is, like I said, I think that's now becoming kind of conventional wisdom? And if so, is there a particularly distinctive angle on that as applies to Sino-Indian relations?
Well, I think you're right. I think he's the first leader who is entirely red, born red, brought up red, educated red in China, always. Unlike Deng, Zhou, all of them, I mean, since Mao, we haven't had a leader like this. Even Jiang Zemin studied abroad in the Soviet Union. So this is, I think, the first time we have a strong centralizing leader who takes politics very personally. If you look at the way he has handled politics, and who takes his responsibility to keep China red very, very seriously, and to maintain the rule of the Communist Party, and to clean up the Communist Party as well, not just anti-corruption, but now the rectification campaign and so on. Uh, so this is somebody who is actually driven by a very strong sense of his own ideology. This is not an ideology which, you know, you can classify in traditional terms. This is actually a homegrown Chinese ideology. And this is why his attraction to traditional Chinese ideas as well. I mean, here you have communist leader who thinks Confucius is good. Uh, you know, it's so the nationalist streak in this communism, and that combination of nationalism with communist ideology, I think that is, for me, that's where his real power comes from. It's also where his appeal comes from, because it's necessary for him to build a personality cult, rely on nationalism, rely on ideology at a time when performance legitimacy is declining, when the party's ability to deliver very high rates of economic growth, frankly, are much lower, and when society is much more complex and much less willing to accept utopian permanent revolution or communism around the corner, great leap forward, and so on. So with a much more complex economy and society, I think it becomes necessary to use these other tools, charisma and so on. And it also becomes necessary, therefore, to be much more intrusive, much more controlling of society and the economy than ever before. I mean, you look at the share of state-owned enterprises has gone up since 2012 from about 16 to about 38% of GDP. If you look at the kind of intrusive surveillance, facial recognition, social credit systems that have been put in place, China spends more on internal security today than she does on national defense. So, I mean, that tells you something about the priorities of the regime and of the leader who has built this regime. But don't forget, he didn't do it alone. I mean, the rest of the leadership has gone along with this, and with changes such as removing term limits and so on, which have further centralized power and changed the way in which the party central works. Traditionally, party central used to be arbiter between different hierarchies, different Shithung, which used to then negotiate a solution at the top. Now it's much more centralized, and it's much more top-down than it was even in Mao's time, which is why Mao had to go over the head of the party to the people and organize mass movements. So this is unique. I don't think we can look back and find examples that will tell us where China is going or how she's going to behave. But I do think that there are some big drivers that drive China today. Three of them, one, she's more dependent on the world than she ever has been in history. She might be more powerful than ever before, but she's also more dependent, whether it's for energy, for markets, for technology, for you name it. She's linked to the world. She's tied irrevocably to the world. Secondly, she's trying to transition to becoming a maritime power, which she has never been in history. But that's because for the first time in history, she's comfortable on land. She's consolidating the Eurasian landmass with Belt and Road, etc. And frankly, Russia, Iran have been pushed into her arms by Western pressure. So she feels no pressure on land. In fact, she's pushing at an open door in the continent. But she is constrained at sea with the world's greatest armada 12 nautical miles off her coast. So for her, and she's trying to make that transition. That's not an easy thing to do, to start thinking like a maritime power when you've never done it before and you have no experience. But more than that, I believe, and here it's purely my opinion, I believe that the Chinese think that their window of strategic opportunity, their moment of relative preponderance of power in the region, and their moment of opportunity is really a short window because of demography, because of her geography. She's surrounded by 14 other countries, many of them rising, and substantial powers, many of them. And because ultimately, you know, the logic of her economy reverting to mean in terms of growth is going to kick in, just as it did in all the other fast-growing economies. So given that, I think this is one reason why I think we see China making these assertive moves and making her moves now, rather than, after all, if as good Marxists they believed history was on their side, they could sit back and relax.
Right.
But they obviously don't. And that, for me, that is the worrying bit. I think we have a tough 5 to 10 years ahead of us.
So let's pursue that a little bit further. Where does India fit, you think, in Xi Jinping's scheme? And maybe as you talk about that, you could talk a little bit about Belt and Road, and to what extent are you see what China's doing with Belt and Road and with the String of Pearls and all that, naval bases through the Indo-Pacific as a really serious strategic challenge to India, or is it more of an effort, to keep the Chinese economy humming along and delay that reversion to mean that you were just talking about?
Seems to me that both Prime Minister Modi and Xi Jinping tried very hard to manage the relationship, even though we're rubbing up against each other in the periphery that we share. When China declares South China Sea a core interest, in the same period, it becomes much more important for India to have freedom of navigation in the South China Sea, because something like 38% of our our trade actually goes through the South China Sea. So China's much more active in South Asia, for instance, committed $62 billion to China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, has invested in ports around India, which could conceivably be used for military purposes, has the first military base in the Indian Ocean and in Djibouti. So certainly we're rubbing up against each other, but I think both governments tried very hard to manage the differences and to manage these issues. President Xi and Prime Minister Modi met something like 18 times, which is, I think, it's quite a number. But I think ultimately, what seems to have happened, and we saw what happened in spring when China tried to change the situation on the ground in the western sector on the border, prevented Indian patrols from going where they've been going for years, and tried to move into territory that had been under Indian control. Might be disputed, but was under Indian control right through. So we now have a military confrontation on the border. But, military reasons are not enough to explain this. You can't say the PLA has taken over Chinese policy and decided that because they need a small piece of land, or they want to dominate a road, or they want to occupy some heights, they've decided to do this. So it seems to me that politically they've watched the evolution of India-US relations over the last few years. We today have levels of interoperability between our forces, which we've never had before. Just today, we've signed the last of the 4 foundational agreements for cooperation between our militaries. And I think they came to the conclusion that India-US relations had gone beyond a point where it was worth their, now it became worth their while to try and convince the US that India was no good as a countervailing power to China, and to convince India that the US wasn't going to pull her irons out of the fire with China, and to show India's neighbors that you can't rely on India. India has to take care of its own problems with China. So for me, therefore, something shifted in the last year or so, not just their view of the effective balance on the border, which I think has kept the peace for the last 40 years or so, and kept the border basically as it was. But for China to try and change that situation by force now suggests to me that their estimation of not just India, but also of the larger political context in which they're operating has changed.
Were they right?
I think they are right in that they have, if you see them pushing in the Senkakus, you see them pushing on Taiwan, you've seen what's happened in Hong Kong, you've seen this on our border. I mean, this is across the board, the South China Sea, This is not just India specific, but I think it stems from an original decision somewhere that the US is out to get us, and that this confrontation with the US is not going away. That while we might, at the edges, at the margins, it might be softer or harder, but basically the US is going to do everything to prevent the rise of a peer competitor in China. And if that is the case, and if the US is also determined on regime change in China, then China has to take countermeasures and do it now. And I think that's what we're seeing. And we see it not just in these flashpoints and around China, in China's periphery, but I think we see it in the renewed attempt at order building, at and the push to get our CEP going, to try and create at least an economic sphere and to use her strengths, which is the economy. That's what BRI is. It's actually a geopolitical use of their, their comparative strengths, which is the economy and economic power. Yes, it creates some jobs in China and deals with some excess capacity, but frankly, it doesn't actually solve that problem. And I'm not so sure that BRI is very popular in China. But of course, I don't suppose that anybody can say so in public.
Yeah. Let me just, I'm going to be opening the floor for questions pretty soon. So again, if you, I mean, there's plenty of material to work with here. So if folks would put questions in the Q&A, we'll move to that shortly. You know, as you think about Sino-Indian relations, one of the things, again, that I thought was fascinating about your article on India's foreign affairs strategy is you talk about India catching up to China, how far behind it is on certain social indicators, where it is digitally, where you say that there's parity. You know, again, I'll try out the conventional wisdom, but I'd really be curious to, I suspect you would disagree with it, but we'll find out. So the conventional wisdom, I think, would be much though American policymakers would like India to catch up with China, it's just not going to happen. That the political system is too chaotic, and that although there are obviously these pockets of extraordinary excellence, particularly in the digital technologies, India just is not really able to break through in the way that the United States would like it to be able to break through. And so therefore, China will always have this edge over India, and in a way that would reinforce the kind of calculation you just described of pushing in Ladakh in order to remind everybody that, you know, it's the Chinese military that can afford the fancy toys, not the Indian military. But what do you, that's a caricature, but what would be your reaction to that?
Well, I think it's dangerous to speak of anything beyond 5 years.
Yeah.
We've been there before. I mean, you know, we've seen very successful hard states suddenly displaying brittleness when in the 70s, 80s, the Indian-Chinese economies were roughly the same size. I think we're making the mistake here that used to be made about China and the US. You know, China's never going to be the US. India will never be China. It's always going to have it has a different resource endowment, it has a whole different approach to life also. And the kind of power that it will accumulate will also be very different from Chinese power. But that doesn't mean that India won't have the ability to embarrass China when it needs to, whether on the border, maritime. There are various, I mean, you are now talking multiple domains. And no two powers are going to be alike, nor are they going to be ever exactly equal. But that's the world we've always lived in, of powers with different levels of capability and vulnerabilities. Both India and China, as a result of the globalization decades, are now tied to the rest of the world. And their prosperity, their stability depends on the rest of the world to a much greater extent than we keep talking of them as though they're autonomous actors, that, you know, Xi Jinping has 360 degrees of freedom to make his decisions, all that Modi does. That's just not true. The more power they have, maybe they have more options, but that doesn't mean that they can ignore these facts, the facts of geography, of dependence, of resource endowment, and so I'm very careful about saying that India can never catch up or will never catch up. India will never be China. It never has been, it never will be. But it will be, and it will be a very different kind of power, I think. But I think it has to stop thinking that it's going to do what China did. The world is different today. You can't do, and that's part of my discussion with my own people. But stop trying to imitate China. Find a way forward, which, as the Chinese say, with Chinese characteristics, you need with Indian characteristics. You need a way forward, and you will be a very different power. India has the ability to work with other powers. Partly it's historical, but if you look at the ability to work with others, with the US, with Japan, with Indonesia, with Vietnam, with Singapore, you know, this is something that I think we need to actually use, and we shouldn't underestimate. There is an advantage in not being the one that everyone thinks is going to be number one.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, this is the Avis and Hertz situation.
Yeah. That's that. I think we just dated ourselves by that reference, but we'll leave that lie. Let me ask one last question before we open it up for Q&A. And again, I just want to remind people to use the Q&A function on Zoom and identify yourselves, particularly if you're a student. So in this wonderful article, League of Nationalists, how Trump and Modi refashioned the U.S.-Indian relationship, that's in, which is in the September-October 2020 issue of Foreign Affairs. Your argument basically is that the Trump administration and the Modi government were quite compatible in some kind of ideological sense, that they have deepened the relationship considerably on the military side, but at the expense of the kind of broader, I wouldn't use the word softer because it's not soft, but the broader cultural, interpersonal connections. I mean, actually the kind of stuff we're doing right now, truth to tell. And, you know, I thought it was very interesting. And I thought one of the things that was striking to me about it is, you know, and I'll put words in your mouth, and you should correct me if I'm misstating it, but you paint a picture, I think, of two illiberally inclined leaders who could get along in part because they were illiberally inclined, and you know, we're focused on China. What will happen if, as I personally believe is likely, sometime after next week, it becomes clear that you're more likely to have a more traditionally liberally inclined American government dealing with an Indian government that is still pretty illiberal on a whole bunch of issues?
Well, you've made my argument much more stark than it is.
Yeah,
But
I realize.
yeah, basically, I do see the relationship as having developed, grown. I say it's probably never been as good, but it has narrowed. I mean, there was a time when we did things like the agricultural green revolution, which made India self-sufficient in food, for instance, when our links in education were much more. But if you look at the number of Indian students coming to the US in STEM subjects over the last few years, last 4 years or so, it's actually gone down. It's actually declining. And that for me is a dangerous sign. It's because those are the things that promote sort of comity between countries. But I do also say that there's more to India-US relations than the relationship between two leaders or their ideological affinity or whatever. Some of it is China, and frankly, China seems to be doing everything it can to make India-US relations great again. But more than that, it's also, there is increasing congruence on other issues, on the Indo-Pacific, on maritime security. in the security field, I mean, it's quite clear: counterterrorism, non-proliferation, etc. But even in other issues, it seems to me that to the extent that the US, India believe in an open economic order and have an interest in promoting that, and India is not part of any bloc. It's not, and frankly, it's walked out of the RCEP negotiations, but it needs an open, and has done very well during the years of the globalization decades. So it seems to me there are other congruences as well which work, which will, I think, frankly, we've always said this is a relationship both of principle and of pragmatism, of practicality. But I do believe that the pragmatic content of this relationship has grown to the point where I think it will see us through no matter what happens next week.
Yeah, I like to, just in terms of the people-to-people connections, I would point out that as a dean, I report to a provost named Sunil Kumar. And, I remember I was lecturing once at the Indian Naval War College in Goa, and the commanding admiral threw a very nice dinner, and a whole bunch of other Indian admirals. Every last one had either been educated in the United States, had relatives in the United States, had children who were studying in the United States. I mean, and it really, I just came away struck by the depth of the interpersonal connections and societal connections, which I think it's just extremely foolish and short-sighted not to put a lot of emphasis on those, because they really are, in the long run, critical. Okay, let me, this is wonderful. I could keep on going, but that would be wrong. We have half an hour left. I'm going to turn now to various questions in the Q&A section, and I'll ask people's forgiveness. I will skip around a little bit, and I may try to condense or rephrase some of the questions. I'm going to start with, and forgive me if I mispronounce your name, Avi Kirpekar, SAIS BA MA class of 2023. And he, as a number of others actually do, is they reference the 2+2 meeting that's taking place this week. And I think the broader question in Avi's, that Avi is raising is, what are the implications of rising US-China competition, both for the Sino-Indian relationship, but I would also say for the Indo-American relationship, because it seems to me that one can stipulate that Sino-American relations are going to be increasingly competitive no matter who's the president in January 21st, 2021. That seems to me to be an overdetermined kind of prediction. What consequences will that have? I mean, obviously, at one level, it predisposes India and the United States to align with one another, but are there other dimensions to that we should be thinking about?
Well, it's, when you look at that triangle, India, US, China, it's been at work now for a long time. I mean, from the Eisenhower administration, towards the end of the Eisenhower administration, Kennedy administration, who saw India as a potential counterweight, to 71 Nixon, when India was seen as somehow getting in the way of the US opening to China. And it's always been a complicated triangle. It's never been straightforward. If China-US relations get worse, the other India-US will get better. That's not quite how it's worked. It's always been much more complicated. And today it's complicated by the fact that both the US and India have very important economic interests in their relationship with China. I mean, the US and China are basically codependent economically. I mean, they're joined at the hip. They're almost like Siamese twins here. And that's something. So there might be strategic competition, I think, is a given. It's structural. It's, as you said, it's going to continue. But that doesn't mean that they won't work together. nor does it mean that China and the US don't share an interest in preventing the emergence of any other peer competitors in the system, and that they actually share an interest in maintaining the distance between themselves and everyone else, which is large and growing today. So this is a much more complicated relationship. So I wouldn't draw a direct parallel to, oh, as China-US relations get worse, India-US will get better, India-China will get better or worse. You could argue it both ways. For instance, China, with a worsening relationship with the US, should have tried, theoretically at least, to keep India out of it, keep India neutral, pay a price to make sure she didn't face the second front while she dealt with her problems to the east. But that's not what's happened this year. And as I said, the only way to explain that is by saying that they must have come to the conclusion that that India has already gone to the dark side. And they therefore need to do something else about it. So I'm a bit cautious about predicting where that triangle will go. China is the cause of considerable strategic congruence between India and the US. But we have an interest in freedom of navigation through the Indo-Pacific, irrespective of what China does, because our economic futures and our security depends on it, for India, for the US as well. So that kind of congruence is not just occasioned by China, which is why I say this is more complicated than my answer to this is to actually be much more granular, break each of these issues down and find willing partners that you can work with on each of them. I mean, my mantra, I think you've heard me say it before, is issue-based coalitions of the willing. And countries like India and the US, who have friends, allies, partners, are in a position to actually work the issues and do that. And that's our strength. And I think we need to do that. On
So
all
just
the things that matter, cyber, on counterterrorism, non-pro, all of them.
but just as a kind of a quick follow-on on that, don't the Chinese have a certain point? I mean, obviously, I would not characterize it as India going over to the dark side, but don't they have a certain point in that basically assessing that India has made a kind of a fundamental, there's a sort of a collective strategic judgment, if you will, by the official mind, if you can use that phrase, saying that, look, in this triangular relationship, we better tilt to the Americans on the whole because we have things in common with them that we don't have in common with the Chinese, and we have issues with the Chinese that are far outweigh some of the ones that we have with the Americans. I mean, so in that case, are the Chinese basically just making a good realpolitik kind of calculation?
Except that you would have expected some attempt in the last 6-8 years to try and see whether it wasn't possible to neutralize India rather than to push her into a much closer relationship with the US. I'm not really sure. I'm not sure that, all these are entirely rational actors, that we all make entirely rational calculations of what the other is going to do and where our interest is. I have some doubts about a rational actor hypothesis in these cases, especially since the rise of the new authoritarians.
Yeah.
I don't know how much they are told, frankly. I don't think the system tells them. I think the system knows. I think all these are professional systems. But when I look at the behavior of Chinese diplomats abroad today, Wolf Warrior diplomacy,
It
or
seems
I look at
counterproductive.
it seems as though this is designed for effect at home, not to create outcomes abroad. But are they in a position to actually report the truth home if it's unpalatable?
Yeah.
I don't know. It worries me.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, look, I think that's a really powerful point. If you get used to a certain kind of politics at home, you can assume that that's how politics works abroad. And
and we all project. We do this.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a really powerful point. Let me ask a question from my colleague here, Vikram Nehru. So again, another societal connection there. Asking, what are India's strategic vulnerabilities? specifically thinking in the Chinese context, but not just that. And what is it that Indian policymakers can do to overcome them, or at least I would say to mitigate them?
Well, I think some of them are clearly, they stem from our resource endowment. Energy security, for instance, it will determine our future. And that's something where now we can hedge, we can balance, we can find various ways of dealing with these issues. But in the last 20 years, we've also created dependencies on China in electronics, in APIs for pharmaceuticals, almost 81%. The power sector is very dependent on Chinese equipment, and in telecom, for instance. So, but the government of India now, I think, is trying to work towards creating more secure, resilient supply chains, working with Japan, with Australia, with other partners, and seeing what they can do. That's one set of sort of vulnerabilities. The others, of course, are much more, and this, I keep saying this, there is no external existential threat to India. If there are real threats to India, they are actually internal. They are in our own confusions. And we need to sort that out. We need a united India where every Indian has the potential to realize their potential. I mean, has a chance to realize their potential. So for me, it's much more important. If you look at the kinds of security issues that we today face, many more of them are internal, the result of urbanization. All indices of violence in India have been declining since the beginning of the century, except for crimes against the person and social crimes and communal crimes. And so for me, that's where we need to work against polarization, against the fragmentation. And some of it is just a consequence of very rapid movements of people into urban settings, where they're out of their traditional family, clan, village, etc. And the effects of globalization, of having the world in the palm of your hand and being exposed to ideas and things that you've never seen before, and frankly don't know how to cope with. So for me, that's where the real issues are, the real vulnerabilities today are, rather than some external threat. There's no existential threat to India today. No, it's too big for that.
Let me, I have a question from not a current student, but a future student, Renan Kao, whose question is about how U.S.-India cooperation will affect Russian policy. And I think that's a really interesting one, particularly given that, of course, traditionally India's been very dependent on Russia for advanced military technology. I think that hasn't ended. How does Russia has interests obviously in Central Asia, kind of north of your border. Could you talk a little bit about how Russia fits in this scheme?
Well, for India is both a maritime and a continental power. And on the maritime front, it's quite clear how congruent our interests are with the US, and we are working increasingly together in the maritime domain and throughout the Indo-Pacific. But when it comes to our continental issues, whether it's terrorism, whether it's land borders, whether it's what we see as the consolidation of Eurasia, Russia has always been a partner, a solid partner in Afghanistan, wherever we've had to work together. And frankly, Russia is a major source of our weapons platforms, of significant platforms that we still use. And we do have a solid strategic relationship with Russia, which has gone on for a long time. We will try our best to keep these two relationships separate and apart. And the proof of it is we use GPS, but we also use GLONASS. And that kind of balancing, I think, becomes more and more necessary, because ultimately the US, once it withdraws from Afghanistan, will have no real presence on the Eurasian landmass. And very few interests either. When you look at in terms of trade, today the US is now increasingly is self-sufficient in energy, is so, and I think frankly, after the experience of the last 2 decades, I can't see the US going back into anything like an engagement, a military engagement on the Asian landmass. I mean, I don't see the political support for that. So for India, we need other partners to work with on the continental side. And that's the sort of distinction I would keep in my mind. And I don't see these necessarily affecting each other. So far, it's interesting. When we've had to discuss these kinds of issues, when we've, for instance, with Iran, with the Bush administration, for instance, the Bush administration might have had one policy, but for us, Iran was our only access to Afghanistan. And they understood.
I was actually part of some of those conversations. I remember that.
And so for me, these are issues that can be talked through and where we can accommodate each other. Doesn't mean we have to follow identical policies, not at all. But we can understand why and where it doesn't affect our core interests. I think we need to cut each other a little slack and move forward, you know, in the interest of a larger goal. And I think we've done it before and we can do it again on a host of issues, actually.
Yeah, that really did, actually, that was something when I was in government struck me about the relationship is, particularly with regard to Iran, there was also an understanding this is where India gets its oil from, and that has a bearing on things. A question from Priyali Sur, who's a SAIS graduate. Should the Quad, so the Quad being India, US, Japan, Australia, be formalized into a more NATO-like alliance to give China a stronger message? Now, usually in my experience in the past, you use the word alliance in front of an Indian diplomat and there's this allergic reaction that breaks out. And you have to take some antihistamines before they can answer. But what would be your response to that?
Well, alliance means a commitment to mutual defense, right? If you're attacked, I'll fight on your side. If I'm attacked, you. I don't think either the US or India or Japan or Australia is ready to enter into that kind of commitment in the Quad yet, which is why they've kept it as a security dialogue. And they work together. And they've also realized that, we're at the extremes of the Indo-Pacific, but there's a huge hole in the middle if you don't involve some of ASEAN's members, some of the countries in Southeast Asia in the work of the Quad. Even simple things like maritime domain awareness, or if you want to say freedom of navigation in these waters, just securing these sea lanes. These are things that will require more than just Quad plus. So I would see this evolving, and it has already tried to involve other countries. Other countries have attended these meetings and these dialogues. I would see it evolving in a much more flexible way, rather than as a new bloc, a NATO. I don't see an Article 5 sort of commitment, in among the Quad members. I don't think any of them is ready for it today.
No. So Joshua Cartwright, a second-year SAIS student, are there fundamental shifts in India's foreign policy that have been brought about by Prime Minister Modi that you think will outlast him? And let me just add a bit of a gloss on that. There's a view of the Trump administration's foreign policy, which is, it's basically traditional Republican style foreign policy with bad manners. And actually that traditional foreign policy is not all that different from Obama foreign policy, with when you get right down to it. I mean, and actually the US-Indian relationship is frequently advanced as a proof of this, that actually there's a lot more continuity in American foreign policy than people think. This relationship, the current relationship goes back at least to the Clinton administration. It's been pursued by Democrats and Republicans alike. And yeah, there's a little bit more Sturm und Drang with Trump. The question is, are there really fundamental differences when you have a leader like a Modi or, in the American case of Trump?
Well, I think in the Indian case, I can't speak to the American case now. Also, I think there is considerable continuity, whether it's the relationship with the US, but I think what there is taking it forward in many ways. And that is certainly true in the relationship with the US, where the Modi government has signed the 4 foundational defense agreements, has increased interoperability between our forces, and has, I think, worked to make the Indo-Pacific a real concept. I mean, a concept that we actually apply in practice. It has done a great deal for the India-US relationship. Also, I mean, there are 2 or 3 other areas where I don't think they get enough credit, which is on climate change, for instance. Mm-hmm. I think they've actually done a fair amount. There are other areas where, if you look at where they are with Pakistan, frankly, it's not very different from the last few years of the UPA. I mean, after the Mumbai attacks, I mean, that's really, that relationship really hasn't moved very far. So that, you could argue, is actually a continuity. I mean, they do in public what used to be done privately in terms of retaliation and cross-border raids and so on. But otherwise, with the rest of the neighborhood, life has become much more complicated as India's relationship with the Chinese has become harder, as outside interest in South Asia has grown. I mean, South Asia was a backwater in the Cold War. The main fault lines were elsewhere. But now, we're beside the main fault lines. And I mean, you have a situation where landlocked Nepal is visited frequently by American visitors to sign on to a free and open Indo-Pacific. And the Chinese, because of their defensive interests in Tibet, for instance, are extremely sensitive to what happens in Nepal, are now willing to be seen actually expressing preferences and interfering in Nepal's internal politics. That reticence is gone. So today, South Asian politics has become much more complicated. I think it's a matter of opinion whether the Modi government has actually managed to deal with it. I think they have a clear concept that they need to change, that the world has changed and they need to change policy. But I'm not sure that they've quite worked it out yet about where the world was going. But you can't blame them. As I said, we're all strategically confused.
Yeah.
And so, I think it's unfair to try and impose some kind of logical consistency or doctrine on what is still essentially continuity with reactions to changing developments. Certainly the relationship with China is today much worse than it was before, and the old modus vivendi is gone, but that's not because of the Modi government. That's for various other reasons, including China's choices. So they're now in a different situation. And I think from now onwards, actually, they will have to start more creative responses of their own. Because, after a while, quantity becomes quality. I mean, we've now reached, I think, that stage.
Yeah. I think, would you say that basically you get continuity and then reaction to concrete problems or circumstances? That, to my mind, that explains most of American foreign policy too. It's only rarely in history that you get those moments. You do get them occasionally where you suddenly have to reconceptualize everything that you thought you knew and what you think your role in the world is and friends and enemies and all that. And I don't know whether or not we're at that moment, although we might be on the verge of something like that. We're coming to the end of our time, unfortunately. One more question. This is from John Michael Murray, who's a mid-career student here at SAIS. Do Indian policymakers view climate change as a national security threat?
They do. They do. because it is a very serious threat for us. I mean, if you look at our numbers of the population who live within, 100 miles of the sea, in fact, much less. You're talking about 200 million people who live within 10 kilometers of the sea. And that's not the only problem. I mean, we're water stressed already. You know how how bad the air in our cities is, since Trump has just told you. Uh, we have serious issues here with the environment, and what's happening is, I think it is now becoming a serious issue for the populace as well. And I can see the difference in not just popular movements, but also the way the courts are reacting, the way other people are stepping in. So I would expect to see some serious responses from the Indian government. As a security issue, it gets caught up with other other day-to-day security challenges. This is the trouble with climate change as a security issue. There's always the urgent always pushes out the important. I mean, climate change is important, but it's always the file that you look at after you've dealt with today's crisis. And I'm not sure that you can point to any one place where the government of India has said, okay, this is the kind of security threat we face. This is how we're going to deal with it. But I think people are aware of the problem. There's no question. And a fair amount of work has been done on that as well.
So let me ask you one question, then we'll wrap things up. As I've been listening to this really fascinating, world-ranging exploration, I've been trying to figure out: are you an optimist or a pessimist? Now that's a gross oversimplification, and I'll stand it. So can you talk to that? Why?
Very simple. I mean, when I became a diplomat in 1972, when I compare where India was then, where the world was then, and where we are now, I mean, I can only be an optimist. And yet, at each stage, we look like we were in the middle of crisis. It was, I mean, the economy was a mess, there were wars going on, and we've always had a lot to do. Thanks to that, diplomats, journalists, professors have always, had careers to make. But the fact is, look at how far we've come. I mean, I think, who was it? Somebody said that, more people are living longer, healthier, and wealthier, more prosperous lives than ever before in human history, a larger proportion of humanity. And I mean, that's something. But of course, every generation thinks that theirs is the moment of crisis, that they are unique, and nobody else has faced problems like this. And I think it's the way we work ourselves up to deal with issues.
Yeah.
And to muddle through and to find some way through. But I was very interested in what you said, when you said that it's rarely given to us to find a moment when we reconceptualize and make big choices. The US has been fortunate. You did so after World War II. You did so again after the end of the Cold War. I mean, you've had that's really quite something. And both times it worked.
Yeah, well, look, and maybe this is a wonderful way to wrap up this extraordinary conversation. This school was founded as part of that reconceptualization. When Paul Nitze and Christian Herter created it, they understood the United States was going to play a different role in the world after the Second World War than it had played really at any time in its history. I mean, like India had always been, although for a shorter period of time, it had always been internationally engaged. But the idea that the United States would be the leading power that would be shaping the world order was brand new. And I must say, I've often thought that as we've passed our 75th anniversary, that's our challenge now as a school, to help people think through what is, I completely agree with you, going to be a different world order. We could go on for so long. I can't tell you how much I appreciate your being willing to take the time to do this. I wish I knew more American diplomats with your range and thoughtfulness. And all I would ask is that you agree to keep on coming back, because we would love to host you. So thank you so much.
Thank you. I really enjoyed that. Thank you very much. That was good of you.
Great. And thank you all for being with us today.